Hi, and welcome to the Luminaries In and Out of Sect podcast, a show about the moon and how astrologers embody and relate to it. My name is S.B. Hall, and I'm your host. In today's episode on the Libra Moon as the Sect Light, I speak with the astrologer and musician, Mercurius George. First off, I want to give a big thank you to everyone that supported me on my drive across the country. I arrived in New York on Friday, and it took me about a week to get here from Los Angeles. We should now be back on track with episode release schedule. Thank you everybody for your patience. I did want to just take a moment to share a little highlight from my trip. The first night of my trip, I stayed at the Grand Canyon. It's something that I had wanted to see for years, especially living in California, but I hadn't really gotten a chance to do it. And it was just an incredible experience to visit, to be there. For anybody out there that's listening, I highly recommend doing it if you ever get the chance. It's really incredible how cool just a massive hole in the ground can be. A highlight from an astrological perspective was that we're now experiencing Venus as a morning star. And in this cycle, I hadn't seen her. But the morning I left California, which was Friday, the 22nd of September, I saw Venus for the first time as I was packing my car to leave. I didn't really plan it. It just kind of happened. Well, it's funny, I did actually elect the time. I elected it with a lot of help from my friend, Kira Ryberg, who's Kira Astrology on all the socials. I just want to give a big shout out to her for her help there because I think it made my trip a lot better and a lot smoother. I originally was going to use a different election with Venus on the ascendant, but after speaking with Kira, she really helped me see why the 12th house Venus was okay and why it would be preferable to have Virgo rising with Mercury on the ascendant. So I just want to give a big shout out to her and just say that if anybody is looking for electional services to elect a trip or to start anything, I'd highly recommend seeing Kira for that. And so it was Virgo rising with Mercury basically on the ascendant. Venus was in the 12th house in Leo. So I kind of knew that Venus would be in the sky, but the astronomy didn't click in with the astrology of the chart. So it was a really pleasant surprise. And then the second day of my trip, I woke up at the Grand Canyon after camping there, and I witnessed Venus in the sky. I was having a bit of a tough morning. I hadn't slept very well, and all of a sudden, Venus just appeared, it seemed, as if she was communicating with me. And in that moment, I felt protected and held and cared for. So it was a really beautiful experience. She's out pretty early in the morning, so if you get a chance to get up early and see her, I would highly recommend it. It's a very beautiful thing to witness in the morning. So that's just a little story from my trip. I hope you enjoy it. Moving on, I'm really excited to announce that I'll be participating in 2 little speaking engagements over the next month. If you listen to this episode the day it's released, I'll be joining Courtney Vivian Henriette, who's Art of the Zodiac on Instagram, on Wednesday, October 4th, on Instagram Live at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. So please come join us then if you are able. She will be asking me some questions about my podcast and my astrological journey and my life. And so I'm really excited and also a little nervous to be participating in that. In addition, I'll be speaking on a past Luminaries In and Out of Sect podcast guest, Catherine Urban's chart rulership panel on Thursday, October 12th from 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern. And that will be on Catherine's Patreon, I believe. I'm really excited to talk about my exalted 8th house Jupiter, which rules my ascendant of Sagittarius, and how that's manifested in my life. And I feel so honored to be among some incredible astrologers that are also in the panel, several of which have also been guests on this podcast. Please see the show notes for more info on both of those events. As always, if you enjoy the work that I'm doing, please contribute to the podcast's sustainability by becoming a supporting member or offering a one-time donation on my website. There you can also find information on my services. I'm currently offering natal and timing consultations, as well as answering horary questions. And to show my gratitude for all those that have shown me love and support lately, I wanted to offer a discount on my readings for this month. Please use coupon code OCT23, that's OCT23, by the end of October for 25% off. Hope you enjoy the conversation. All right, Jared, thank you so much for being with me here today. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you doing? I know you've got a lot going on.
Yeah, I'm doing okay. I'm hanging in there, taking every day a day at a time. Just for listeners' context, we were just talking before the recording. I had a breakup 2 months ago. I'm moving across the country. It's September 20th for any listeners. Moving across the country on Friday to drive back to New York. I learned yesterday I'm maybe getting laid off next week. There's a pretty good chance. So there's a lot going on in my life. Definitely felt stressed yesterday, but today's a new day. I'm hanging in there. I'm doing my best to just put one foot in front of the other. So yeah, thank you for asking.
Totally, yeah.
How's the recent astrology been for you? I know you're a Mercury rising. Has the Mercury retrograde been eventful? Venus retrograde? What's been going on?
Both have been, well, I would say the Mercury retrograde has been more externally eventful.
Mm,
It went, it stationed retrograde on my Mars and stationed direct on my ascendant in my first
wow.
house. And there's like so many logistical things going on because I'm getting married in exactly a month.
Wow. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm having like a different kind of intense moment in my life of like very like things really solidifying and stabilizing, and
Mm,
but that comes with a lot of pressure and just like chaos that managing
yeah.
chaos, potential chaos, which for me is definitely the kind of thing where I can spin out a little bit.
Hmm.
um all that Virgo energy.
Yeah.
I have a
Yeah.
lot to do, which I can sometimes appreciate, but I can also get a little, you know, I like to control the chaos and I don't always succeed. So
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I feel like we're getting into your chart a little bit right off the bat, but you have
mhm.
Virgo rising, you have Mercury and Scorpio. So I feel like I wonder if that really speaks to like this desire for things to kind of this tension of mutability, but also this desire for like a kind of fixity.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I wish you all the best with the next month. Doing all this footwork for the wedding, and I'm super happy for you. So congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, wonderful. Jared, can you offer? So Jared, you are known online first of all as Mercurius George. For those listening on all the socials and whatnot, can you give us a brief introduction to yourself and to your astrological practice?
Yeah. Um, yeah, so I kind of stumbled into this very silly pseudonym because it was my Twitter handle back before I had any intention of like calling myself an astrologer or even,
Mm,
doing consultations for people. And it really just kind of stuck, and I feel like I developed some name recognition. And so,
hmm.
but I also have this desire, rightly or wrongly, to kind of to hide behind the pseudonym. It
Mm,
just makes it a lot easier for me to like express myself freely when it comes to all things sort of um, you know, left of center, uh,
right.
mystical, and
Hmm.
even just generally philosophical, or just talking about any kind of weird stuff.
Mm.
So
What is that Oscar Wilde quote? Like, men are most free to be themselves when they wear a mask, or something like that.
I don't know that quote, but I definitely relate to that.
Yeah,
Um,
something about like being able to authentically present when you have this kind of buffer,
yeah,
which feels
totally.
very like online in a way.
Oh, yeah, Oscar Wilde could never imagine how far we were going to take that. People have like 7 alt accounts,
Right.
you know. I'm sure he'd have a great time. He would have done a lot better in our time than
He
the
would have
time that he
done
lived.
really well in our time, I
Very,
think.
very well.
Yeah.
Although I do think the Victorian aesthetic, like, the people probably perceived his wit on stage, through a sensibility that maybe doesn't quite exist now in the same way. So,
Yeah, totally.
he had his fate. So anyway, as for my practice, I I would say that I have a Hellenistic background, maybe not quite as intensely technical as a lot of our peers, many of whom have kind of lapped me since they first showed up on the scene. I also mostly studied with Austin Coppock, and so he has a really big impact on how I think about astrology, what kind of like
Amazing.
interpretations, delineations I do. And I feel like one thing that's great about studying with Austin is you get to sort of download all of his takes, which are many and which are frequently very insightful, but also pretty unique to him in terms of like how he arrived at various conclusions about stuff. And also like he's not one to box himself in too much in terms of like where he, places himself chronologically, or he doesn't like push away 20th century material if it's useful. And I think that has influenced me a lot. I'm not a psychological astrologer, and I honestly haven't spent a lot of time with like the classic work of psychological astrology of the 20th century, and yet I know that it's very profoundly impacted my understanding of astrology through osmosis, and even just my own insights. Like, we're coming at astrology as 21st century people.
Right.
I've been through the process of like depth psychology. It's how I mean, it's not the only way, but it's one of the major ways I think about the world and life.
Right.
And so to artificially, push it aside would be very unnatural for my whole way of thinking about stuff. So
yeah,
that's kind of the best I can do to describe where I sort of stand in all of that.
Cool. Thank you for that. Yeah, you reminded me of a quote. I think it was a tweet by Rob Bailey, who also has been a guest on this podcast, Gemini Moon episode. Go back, listen to it. He talked a lot about the medieval kind of worldview in that episode, actually. But in this tweet, he was talking about how we're all kind of modern astrologers, no matter what we're practicing, because like, I don't want to speak about we and all the things that we've inherited, because I know that we can be a loaded thing. It's like, who is that? Who are we assuming when we use that word? But, there is a modern worldview and framework that we all have. And there have been, we all have kind of inherited this 20th century modern psychological astrology thing. And that's a part of the astrological landscape. And so I think that whether we reject that or not, whether we don't practice that style of astrology or not, it is kind of seeped in a way.
I definitely agree with that. I also think, different people have different levels of like, potentially even self-conscious like effort to, to push aside attitudes that they don't want to integrate. But I think another way of thinking of it, which is what I get from your paraphrase of Rob Bailey, is that, the same way that if you're trying to read like Firmicus Maternus, you have to read it through the lens of Roman society.
Right.
And even, and if you can, his biography, and, all the delineations about, this combination, Mars square Venus, you're going to have a much better understanding of how to universalize that delineation if you understand like the sexual mores of that society.
Absolutely.
It's stuff like that. So like we can't remove ourselves completely from our context. But I do think some people try more than others to have, to exercise control in that way, and I think mostly it's like traditional astrologers who are trying to get back to like the unreconstructed, that old time religion, like, only working with the 7 traditional planets and all of that stuff. Yeah. And I'm not really one of those.
Yeah, I do have a question about that if you would indulge me, because I mean, so first thing I want to say is that I don't have a modern astrological like background. Like I kind of came in learning Hellenistic and medieval like techniques in astrology. So I just want to say that like I obviously like use the outer planets, but I don't use them a ton in my practice. But the question I want to ask is about this term traditional, because it seems to me like it's one of those things that I have some of these moments in the astrological community, or whatever word you want to use, where there are certain words that are used that I'm just like, why do we use that word? Because it feels a little absurd to me. Like traditional astrology feels like a unmoored, unanchored term to me, because I'm like, what tradition? What are we talking about when we're talking about traditional? Like Hellenistic, okay, that makes sense. Medieval Islamic, that makes sense. But traditional could be 17th century England, or it can be, 3rd century the Mediterranean. And so it's like, it's this term that I don't particularly like. And I'm just curious, like you seem like a person that's interested in precision, interested in words. And so I'm just curious to get your take on that term.
No, I totally agree. I feel, it's a lot like Western, where ultimately it's not just a flawed term, it's like actually like an infuriatingly flawed term. I think there's a little more of an issue with Western, like it's a little like you actually kind of have to engage with it, whereas I think you are raising a good point that you can basically just stop saying traditional, because we don't really need a catch-all term for like everything before 1920 or whatever that might be. And it's not particularly useful to put William Lilly in the same box as like Ptolemy or
Vedius Valens
or Vedius Valens. They all are coming from a different place and they're doing different things for different reasons. But I think the reason that goes on, and the reason that it took off in the first place as a term, is because there is a real schism, basically. And I think it's like, come the Enlightenment, astrology is no longer, like for a pretty long time, it's no longer a useful way of like making sense of the universe in the way that people really desired to make sense of the universe at that point. And so then when astrology started to kind of come back in a more of a New Age context, after being, obviously being around throughout that time period, but it came back as like a pretty different thing, making different claims, reaching different conclusions, etc. And most importantly, using new planets, and a lot of the practitioners of quote unquote modern astrology just like literally like lost track of the tradition. So I think it mostly just boils down to like, do you believe in this schema, about rulership and all of that stuff? And if you're working with that, then that's, for better or worse, we can call that traditional astrology, right?
Right. Yeah. Or I think the real departure with modern, like as it relates especially to Enlightenment thinking, quote unquote Enlightenment thinking, is like this real internalization and psychologizing of astrology. And so it's kind of like, do you think of astrology as an internal landscape completely? And I know that's like pre-Enlightenment with like, for example, what's his name? Pacino, the planets within, there's this idea as well of like this internal landscape astrologically that goes, is like pre-Enlightenment or perhaps like concurrent with it. But yeah, there's this view in kind of ancient astrology or Hellenistic or what have you, whatever term you want to use, of like the chart reflects the whole life, not just the internal landscape, not just the psychology of the native.
Yeah.
So I think
I
that's an important distinction as well.
I will say though, because I feel like there's this framing that, let's say, psychological astrology, it's like it's all about the internal life.
Mm-hmm.
And that, it's just like the archetype of the father, the symbol,
Mm-hmm.
but like those astrologers were still working with transits. And I think the second you integrate transits into your
Mm-hmm.
practice, it's pretty hard to claim that it's just about the internal life.
Right.
And also, I think it's just disingenuous in general to talk about astrology ever in any way without framing it or acknowledging it as looking at the meeting point between the internal and the external, because it's
Mm-hmm.
just such an obvious extension of all of the as above, so below,
Right.
you know, stuff that just comes with the territory. And I
Mm-hmm.
feel like I don't really believe that there were that many like prominent practicing astrologers who actually believe that like, what your chart says is just going to be an internal experience. I
Mm-hmm.
think that it's mostly a in that time period when they were like, when astrologers were chasing scientific credibility in a world that was not going to give it to them,
Mm-hmm.
that was like kind of a fallback position.
Right.
And it was almost like, we'll tell you this until you already get so deep into it that you're
Right.
ready to embrace the fact that it's more than that.
Right. The we'll have the explicit truth, and then there's the esoteric truth.
Yeah,
Um,
which I mean, whatever, that's fine, but I don't take it too literally, because I just feel
mhm.
like at the end of the day, anybody who's, you know, deep enough into astrology to actually call himself an astrologer has probably reckoned with the fact that they basically think that you can make predictions, because otherwise,
Mhm.
what are transits? I mean, you can't,
Yeah.
maybe they'll fall in different, they'll have slightly different attitudes about how concrete those predictions can or should be,
Mhm.
whether in terms of how it works, or even just like what's useful and what's helpful and what's therapeutic,
Yeah.
um, which is, I think, another supposed traditional modern divide.
Mhm.
Um, but I don't really think it's as different in terms of how it's supposed to work. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
my.
And even
I
in
was thinking about that the other
pre-modern,
day.
yeah, even in pre-modern astrology, there is this difference between like there's like the Mercurial and Saturnian elements of learning astrology, where Mercurial you learn via texts, and Saturnian you learn via the bestowing of knowledge from a teacher. And there's esoteric knowledge that you're going to get in that process that you're not necessarily going to get for a book. And it makes kind of sense from, if we think about the history of modern astrology and the legal implications of astrology and making predictions, where it's like Alan Leo in the early 20th century gets sued
Hmm.
because someone is like, you gave this advice and it was, what, I don't know the details of the Alan Leo you
Case.
know case, but it makes sense that the defense would be like, oh well, we're just talking about internal things here, because there are real legal implications, I think. And as astrology now becomes more popular in the 21st century, we may have to kind of reconsider this more seriously, of
Hmm.
like, how do law and astrology interact when really impactful advice or predictions or what have you are being made.
For sure. We'll see what that Saturn Neptune conjunction
Mm-hmm.
brings about.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Yeah, I just wanted to share a little bit about how we know each other. So for like reference for listeners, did we meet at NORWAC?
Yeah, we met in Norwalk 2022. Although I did
Right.
not at the time perceive you as an astrologer, I perceived you as like the cool, like supportive partner who was around and participating and curious, which I
Mm-hmm.
have honestly admired and it's so interesting to watch how extremely you've engaged with the topic since then.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting to hear reflected. Thank you for that, because that was the role that I was playing kind of at NORAC 2022. No, I'm sorry. NORAC 21. Was it
I think
21?
it was 22. Yeah.
NORAC 2022. That was the role I was playing. And then like that was really the an important part in my own life and journey in terms of studying astrology, because like the seed and the passion for studying was really like planted at that time. And it is, yeah, I'm now remembering the conversation we had about, I was telling you, I was like trying to read Cosmos and Psyche, or I wanted to read Cosmos and Psyche. And you were telling me about your experience reading that. And yeah, so it was really cool memory. A
The
lot of great.
listeners, what do we have to say about Cosmos and Psyche? I mean, I feel like whenever I have an opportunity to talk about this, it's like just acknowledge that it could be shorter and don't
Mm-hmm,
take it personally. And
mm-hmm.
if you need to let your eyes glaze over, that's okay. Just keep rolling through it and take breaks. So that's my
Yeah.
Cosmos and Psyche advice. And it provides a lot of dividends if you can have the patience. It's a pretty amazing book.
Yeah. I think that was the advice that you gave me. You were like, you know, just take it bit by bit, because it is a pretty massive book. Um, yeah, and I've read some big books, but it's very wordy and it's a bit repetitive,
It's a bit repetitive.
which is okay, because he's giving a lot of examples about outer planet transits and how that relates to world history. So he's trying to build a case, and it's
Mhm.
understandable. Um, so
Yeah.
yeah, and then yeah, we've met up in LA a little bit when you and your partner came to visit, and yeah, it's been cool getting to know you as well, interacting online. So just
Mhm.
want to give a bit of context for listeners with that.
Our bona fides.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you think back to your childhood, did you have a relationship with the moon as a child? And if so, like, can you tell me a little bit about that, or do you have like a memory that comes to mind from that time?
Yeah. I've thought about this because I've listened to other episodes, and it's so interesting to hear what other people have to say. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like maybe compared to some people, I was a little less like of like a baby witch, like the moon has called to me, and
Uh-huh.
especially when I was a kid. I think I was really I lived in a house right next to the woods. Like my bedroom window looked out on the woods, and
Mm-hmm.
I think I was really pulled into nature as a kid, and I was just kind of like this, I have these idyllic memories of just like being outside so much and running around and catching frogs and all, really kind of like
Nice.
idyllic you know experiences in nature. And somewhere in there, there's definitely that majesty and wonder applied to the sky.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so but I don't have a lot of like core memories
Yeah.
about the moon from like childhood, but I have a lot from a little later in my life, like college and beyond,
Mm-hmm.
which is still like early college, like still pre-astrology for me. I wasn't really
Right.
I don't remember. I'm sure I knew that I was a Libra or something like that, but I really didn't care about it at all. But
Mm-hmm.
I did develop a kind of like a very intense fascination with the moon, um, and and the sun as well to some extent, but more so the moon. The
Mm-hmm.
moon is you can actually look at the moon.
Right.
That's one of the benefits. um, and I also I'm not gonna probably get into this too much for the sake of keeping my identities separate,
Mm-hmm.
but I am a singer-songwriter, and I found myself like talking about the moon in songs a lot
Mm.
around that time period, and it became this sort of like ongoing imagery and motif that I would pull on and draw on,
Mm.
which is really interesting now because I can kind of go back to that phase of life and see how like there were these sort of archetypes emerging, into consciousness, which I was attaching to planets. I mean, even it was like sun, moon, and even a little bit, Venus, because without doing much of a deep dive, I had associations, you know?
Hmm.
Um, and so I think that that was one of the reasons I got into astrology, even just like the very early stages of being interested in knowing like any basic stuff about my chart, which
Hmm.
really started around age 20, 21 for me,
Hmm.
which is when I met someone who's still my friend and who is very much a part of the astrology community, Spencer Michaud.
Oh, cool.
Um, and he was just starting to get into astrology and kind of like gave me my first reading, which I'm sure he would take back if he could. But um, yeah, so I do have these really powerful memories of the moon from that phase of my life, and
Hmm.
it being this sort of the moon felt like a muse for me.
Mm,
Um,
amazing.
yeah.
Is any of that music available anywhere?
Hmm.
Is it on Spotify or what have you?
It's out there.
Okay, cool.
It's on all the platforms. I will
Cool.
share it with you. And if you're really interested as a listener, you can always reach out to me and maybe I will send it to you as well.
Cool. We'll put your contact info in the show notes if
Mhm.
anybody's interested. Yeah, it's interesting thinking about like now the kind of natural significations of planets and thinking about the moon as a connector and thinking, just thinking about like, oh, what was my relationship with the moon in college? And remember being on the phone with someone that I was romantically engaged with, and they were far away. I think I was in Baltimore and they were in New York, and it was like sunset, and it was one of those moments, kind of like feels a little cliche now to say and a little
Mhm.
vulnerable, but it's like looking up at the moon, talking to them, and like this idea of like, okay, I know that this person is looking at the moon at the same time, and it's this idea of like being connected by something in the
Hmm.
sky that brings us together when we otherwise like can't physically be together. So
I
I'm reminded of that.
I think that's beautiful. Cliche or not.
Yeah, yeah. It's I think from a movie, but I can't remember
Mm.
what movie where they talk about like looking at the moon together and it being a connector, but I can't remember what movie it is. If anybody that's listening knows, please let me know. Um
I had a handful of I studied abroad in South America and I had a handful of just like really weird moments with the moon. There was one time that I woke up from this like extremely weird dream and I walked over to the window and I opened the blinds and there was like this full moon just like right there. It was in in the middle of the night. It must, thinking back, I'm like, it must have been not that long before sunrise.
mhm,
So, it was like almost moon set, right? And now that I know some astronomy through astrology,
right.
um, and it was just like this, there was this really like mysterious, weird energy. I've never even talked about this before, but,
Mm,
and I had this guitar part that I had written like 2 years earlier, and I had never known what to do with it. And I ended up writing this song about like a werewolf, just
nice.
because I was just so like overwhelmed by just the presence of the moon and just the underlying weirdness. Obviously, I wish I could find the chart now because it was probably
Hmm.
like a full moon in Scorpio or something, something
Right.
like that. But
Uh-huh.
and there was another time that I was sitting on a rooftop and I was in Santiago, Chile, and there's this big statue of the Hill, which is like lit at night. It's like lit from below,
Hmm.
and I had this incredible image of like the statue and then the full moon in the sky and then the moonlight reflected in the swimming pool on the rooftop of this
Wow.
place where I was, and like it was just like it was just one of those weird experiences where like I really feel like something came through for me, and this ended up being another song for me.
Mm,
um and where I just there was something about encountering like these two different very different feminine archetypes, one from the natural world and one that's like tightly controlled
Mm,
by society and by patriarchy.
right.
And even like as like a 20-year old, I was like really kind of like overwhelmed by what I was seeing with my own eyes.
Hmm.
And I was perceiving that kind of core, like, sacred feminine
Hmm.
um material, like just through the experience of seeing the moon and seeing the statue. So
Mm,
I feel like there was some, depending on how like weird I want to get about it, it feels like those it just felt like one of those faded moments.
mm,
Um, yeah. So that was like how I started to just become like a weird person. Before that,
nice.
I was really not, I had some family background which would sort of maybe push me toward being a little mystical, but
Hmm.
um from my mom, but I wasn't, I was very much just like your standard like annoying mansplainy like rationalist materialist college student
Mm,
asshole.
yeah.
Um and it all,
Interesting.
yeah, esotericism reached out and grabbed me
Right.
against my will.
That's so funny because it's really interesting again thinking about like the natural significations of the moon, and she's associated with dreams, and so it's interesting that you had this weird dream and then you looked out and this big full moon that was setting, and then that sparked you to write a song. And then I also think about the moon as like intuition, and my experience with the moon, and like uh it's funny you could think of it as like downloads, but like I do feel like the my interactions with the moon kind of like magically, for lack of a better term, is it feels kind of like a lightning strike. It feels kind of like getting hit pretty directly and pretty quickly, where this, the kind of intuition just comes to you. And so yeah, it's really interesting that you had a similar experience and that it kind of like really opened you up to a different path from where you were.
Yeah. And I don't think that I would have ever gotten into astrology if I wasn't just kind of fascinated with the moon, and just like really like I just really see the moon as like so beautiful.
Mm,
Um, Everything else in the sky can be beautiful, but it doesn't hit me in the same way.
right.
Like when I look at, I mean, definitely if you're looking at stuff through like the James Webb telescope, like obviously like, you'd have to be
Right.
pretty annoying to not be wowed by that.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, just in terms of like being a human being on planet Earth and looking up, um, the moon is just very, very special.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. It's very like it's just so immediate and so visible. It's like, yeah, I was on at the Mount Wilson Observatory, which is like one of the, they say one of the best places to look at the sky here in LA, last night. And I'm looking at stars with my Stellarium app, and it's just like, okay, that's Arcturus. Like you have to have this mediation of
Hmm.
technology, unless you really know the stars. But I'm like, okay, that's Arcturus, kind of shining in its weird way, and that's Ursa Major, and all these things. And with the help of technology, I can kind of figure out what's going on. But like the moon is so immediate, and it's you don't need any kind of help to know
Hmm.
the phase that it's in, and um, where it is in the sky. Like it's very kind of apparent and immediate. And there's some things like, okay, what constellation is it in, and what fixed
Hmm.
stars is it near, and what sign it's in. Those kind of what is it waxing or waning? Those kinds of things. It's like, okay, maybe that needs a little study, but
Hmm.
yeah, the moon I feel like just kind of presents itself to interact with.
Yeah. I think I've never really thought about it this way, but if I were gonna then kind of rank in terms of like overwhelming majesty,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm kind of ignoring the sun because the sun is just so like overbearing,
Yeah.
like you obviously take it for granted.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you also, as I kind of mentioned earlier, you can't look at it, um,
Right.
which is a big deal.
If you're
So I
out in it
feel like,
too long, it also will hurt you. Like, I
yeah,
don't know.
that too.
I have like pale Irish skin. Like,
Yeah,
it
Sam.
will burn me.
I've paled like, a third Scottish skin.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, Um, yeah, and like so I would say, the next one to kind of hit me like that was Venus. And I think
Mm,
Venus takes a little more uh attention and effort to really like notice, but when you do notice, Venus is also quite stunning. I also had
absolutely.
a real experience with Venus when I was studying abroad in Chile, because um this astronomer from my university was coming down to use a telescope in northern Chile. And
Hmm.
they offered to the people in my program, like, does somebody want to go visit? And I was like, obviously,
Hmm.
surprisingly, not that many people wanted to do it. Just two of us wanted to go. And they're like, all right, you can go. And
Interesting.
he showed us around. He explained his research. It was like tracking like errant satellites in the sky.
Mm.
Um, and he showed us Saturn through a telescope, which was very, very cool. But then at like 4 in the morning, I watched Venus rise over the mountains.
Oh my God.
And it was just like, and like, this is like a world renowned place for stargazing. So I
Hmm.
also saw the Milky Way, and like
Hmm.
we saw the International Space Station fly over our heads, which I didn't know about until then. I thought that was really cool. But
Hmm.
definitely the highlight was like watching Venus rise over the mountains naked eye.
Mm.
Um, I think I was just really overwhelmed again by how amazing that is.
Yeah.
Especially like all these experiences that I'm finding myself sharing were not planned, you know.
Right.
I didn't know that I was going to watch this like incredible
Mm.
sight of perceiving another planet like shining really brightly
Mm.
um, as our planet turns. It's just so cool.
Yeah.
I think all those things really planted a seed for me.
Mm. Yeah, I'm just struck by this idea. I was like tweeting yesterday about everything that's going on in my life, and I'm like, I feel like fate is trolling me. Like, what the hell,
Mhm.
And I'm just struck kind of emotionally, hearing you talk about these things because it reminds me of the fact that not only can fate be the challenging things that we happen to intersect with or that happen to unfold in our life, but like there's so much that's beautiful about fate. There's so much that um, I'm like reminded of this quote and like the spiritual circles I run with that it's like um, I'm glad I did. I'm glad God didn't give me what I deserve because I would have, things would have been very different, and there's a real grace, I think, that can come with fate where you can have these experiences of the things that you need or you're supposed to have that are just incredibly beautiful and move your life forward in really significant and meaningful ways. And I really think that it's easy to take that for granted because we think about fate as the negative things, perhaps, but it's also the good.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think because we don't want to take responsibility for the things that suck.
Yeah.
And like, which is, I'm not saying that to say like we're more responsible than we think they are. It's more that like
Hmm.
then we kind of claim more ownership of the things that are like, oh, that amazing moment. Um,
Hmm.
Instead of, maybe sitting with the general lack of control that we experience over the vast majority of things,
Right.
the negative and the positive,
Hmm.
which is a very threatening reality.
Yeah, it definitely can be. It definitely can be. But I'm grateful for the reminder right now because, yeah, I definitely need it.
Mhm.
And it reminds me of all the beautiful things that I've also experienced in my life that I didn't plan and didn't necessarily quote unquote deserve or
Mhm.
anything like that, but I experienced nevertheless. Okay, so let's talk about the moon a little bit in your astrological practice and what it kind of means for you today. And yeah, why do you think it's important that we like focus on the moon when we talk about astrology?
Yeah, so um, I think maybe a good place to start is like my general spiel that I would give if I were doing a consultation.
Hmm.
If I was going to talk to somebody about their moon placement, I try to emphasize that, or as a starting point, as a way in, I think about how the planets can represent kind of different stages of life,
Mm.
and the moon being the very beginning.
Hmm.
So I love this image of just like when you're an infant, um, you're completely dependent on your caretakers,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, and that being a lunar stage immediately sort of sets the tone.
Mm.
Needs, dependency, care, caretaking, all are contained within that. Um, and, other thing about being an infant is you can't really communicate, and you also can't distinguish between feelings.
Mm.
You're just a blob of feelings. Um, and so positive, negative, um, good and bad haven't really made it in there yet.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and like you just know when you need something, the only way you can say it is by crying, right?
Mm.
Um, and so there's this implication of like pre-verbal mind body. It's that, like, I don't know if non-dual is the right word here, but there
Mm.
is um a core, there's this core, I don't even know if self is the right word, but there's this core experience that we all experience, and
Mm-hmm.
we all in some way surely continue to experience and contain. And I feel like we build on top of it,
Mm-hmm.
we build thinking capacity. We have the mercurial capacity. We learn how to communicate one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we learn how to distinguish between these different feelings
Mm.
and needs. And then we learn, like, to perceive ourselves, and we develop the solar. I don't know if I'm getting the order totally right, but um, the point is just that that's how I mostly see the moon, as like it is this pre-verbal somatic experience that we continue to carry inside, and we've built an identity around that, but we never fully transcend or escape.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so whether or not the moon in your chart ends up being like the best way to understand your childhood experiences, I think there is that. And inner child even might be a kind of misleading term.
Mm.
Um, it's more about trying to imagine an iteration of self that can't rely on Mercury, can't rely on the sun, and hasn't experienced Venus and Mars and Jupiter and Saturn.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I just find that to be a useful way of thinking about the
Mm.
moon in terms of like just like what is the deal with the moon, right?
Right.
Then obviously there's a lot of other, I mean, there's infinite amount of cool ways to think about the moon and astrology and like
Can I ask
cycles of
a
growth.
can I ask a question real quick
Yeah.
about what you were just talking about? So just to be clear, are you talking about Ptolemy's Ages of Man?
Uh, I don't, not consciously, because I
Okay.
barely engage with Ptolemy at all. It's
Okay. Interesting. Because like Ptolemy has this, I don't know if it's just Ptolemy. I don't know much about this timing technique, but just like decennials or Fradaria, every planet gets like 10 years. In
mm,
the Ages of Man, there's a division of certain years for each planet, and the moon actually gets the first. I'm reading Astro by Max's tweet right now where he kind of talks about this, but he says the moon gets the first 3 years, followed by Mercury, which gets 4 to 13. Venus gets 14 to 21, etc.
oh wow.
Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. So you're kind of describing
Yeah.
this technique. And it's really interesting that it's just the first 3 years that the moon gets, which is that time of like um, the real reliance of the child on the
Right.
parent to exist. And then around 4, it's like, I started school at 4, I went to kindergarten. So there's this kind of like differentiation that starts
Mhm.
at that age. So it's really interesting.
I would say that I'm sure that I've encountered that framework, probably indirectly. I imagine also like at least a good amount of what I'm saying is probably somewhere back there comes like from Austin,
Mm-hmm.
or at least it's influenced by things that he said,
Mm-hmm.
without a doubt. Um, and but then also like, for instance, I remember watching just like some series about child development, like just the first few years.
Mm-hmm.
And some of this stuff, just having like planetary significations in the back of my head while watching that was just kind of like, oh, well, like you can just see like, oh, here's like ego development at this stage, and it's one of those things where, the human mind, or whatever, the human like being,
Mm-hmm.
develops in these stages like clockwork. It's not
Mm-hmm.
going to always be like exactly like, 2 years, 9 months, and 7 days, but like it's around there. And um, it's just very clear that there's something in like our rhythms of development, which is following an order.
Right.
And obviously it's like a big intellectual leap to be like, oh, and that order is related to the planets of the
Yeah.
solar system, like that. If you're not into astrology, like that's something that you'd say if you were insane.
Mm-hmm.
But but it is, it does, like many things with astrology that seem insane at first, it is it most, or at least useful, and I think more so, like just correct. It's just like
Mm-hmm.
it's just a reflection of universal reality on some level.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah. Were you going to talk about other cycles, or would you like to move
Yeah.
on?
I mean, I don't think I have anything original to say about, the moon in astrology generally. Like beyond that, I'd like obviously like looking at growth and decay.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you're looking at inception, I think the moon is obviously super important.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, I mean, I don't do a lot of electional astrology. Like, I don't
Mm-hmm.
offer electional astrology, but I am always perfectionistically, looking at charts and doing all this stuff. And
Right.
I'm thinking, and also then just like being alive, I'm looking at the moon like every 25 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
just because it's always receiving an influence.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
and it's just so, I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, but it's just like, it is just so descriptive of, um, yeah, it's so descriptive of the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And it's usually in some way reflects my mood.
Mm.
And I also think it's just super interesting that the moon is the one thing that, like, well, let me back up. I think when I first got really into astrology, something that kind of tied me up a little bit was coming to the conclusion, or realizing that like we're all living through the same transits at the same time. And
Mm-hmm.
it didn't take me that long to wrap my head around the fact that like they're going to hit us all very differently because we all have
Right.
different charts.
Right.
Um, but I think that there's the moon plays a particularly special role in this way, and it seems potentially related to the association of the moon with like the public and the collective, that
Mm-hmm.
like, you know I do really, since I've gotten into astrology, it does really feel like, and I don't think it's a delusion. um it does seem like there is like a collective mood that people, experience more than they should,
Yeah.
on any given day. And it's
Mm-hmm.
not just something that you can trace back to like a causal series of events. It's like, oh, well, yeah, did you see the thing in the news? Of course, we all feel like this today.
Right.
Um, and obviously, everybody's having a very different experience in any given
Mm-hmm.
day, blah,
Mm-hmm.
blah, blah. But I do feel like the moon to me is it's just so endlessly like interesting, and it always pulls my attention every single day of my life, because I feel like it really does provide the best way to look at what are we living collectively. And it's just like, well, where's the
Mm-hmm.
moon? What
Right.
aspects is it making? You know?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Totally. Yeah, it's very interesting to think about the moon as the people, especially like with all the commentary around like full moons and how that affects crime and things of that nature. Like, and yeah, it's interesting too, because I think someone who's maybe a little skeptical could be like, well, if you're feeling like a vibe at a particular time, that's maybe like your projection or whatever. But it's interesting, like going on Twitter, what have you, and you know, like I was having a very weird experience under this recent Scorpio moon. And like I went on Twitter and other people are like, yep, this is feeling real weird where I'm at too. People are acting in these really strange ways. And, it's not, of course, it's not like a perfect thing, but, um, it's interesting to see these similar observations happening independently of one another.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, and obviously we can't be objective about this stuff, but like who wants to be objective when you talk about the moon? And it's, it's
Yeah, it's like
subjectivity writ
should
large.
our goal be objectivity? I don't know exactly. I mean, that's a whole kind of
Oh
philosophical
yeah,
conversation.
it's a bottomless pit.
Hmm. Yeah,
Which is fun to go spelunking in,
totally.
um but yeah, probably outside the purview of this conversation.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, and like, but even if you do want to engage with some level of objectivity about the moon, it is the starting point. The sun and the moon are clearly, you know, astral bodies that have a huge impact on day-to-day life.
Right.
One thing that really struck me was I watched one of these series about like I think it was Night on Earth on
Hmm.
Netflix, and it was
Hmm.
just like various snapshots of the natural world at night, with like cutting edge photography and blah blah blah.
Hmm.
And one of the things that really, I mean, there were so many examples of how like, okay, well, we're seeing these animals at this moment under a new moon or under a full moon, and like
Hmm.
the animal world is living truly like according to lunar rhythms, and like
It's
it's
attuned.
like, are you going to go hunting or not? Like, are you as prey scared shitless right now, or
Hmm.
are you reasonably chill? That's like often going back to moonlight. And then obviously there's most of life on earth is underwater, and
Hmm.
you just can't like even begin to understand it without looking at the effect. The moon is such a big deal for
Hmm.
life on Earth.
Yeah.
Um, and you don't have, obviously, like Neil deGrasse Tyson isn't gonna like get on this call and like play along with the astrological spin on that.
Hmm.
But
Yeah, I mean, Neil deGrasse Tyson, people like Neil deGrasse Tyson and Bill Nye will also like downplay the importance of philosophy even as an academic
sure,
pursuit. Like I've heard them just be like, all you need is science. And it's like science is the study, is like the measurement of empirical phenomena or the measurement of the material world. Science is not necessarily like a worldview. And we need things like philosophy or perhaps spirituality, which, like bef- I think Neil deGrasse Tyson is a particularly problematic person. So I don't want to give him too much air, but like I watched that whatever show he was like narrating like 10 years ago. I forgot what it's called, whatever. But he was talking about like comets and how they figured out comets were in an omen and they were just like a phenomenon that happened periodically, and how that related to having science as a kind of spirituality, like the wonder of witnessing the vastness of the universe and the vastness of time as we relate to it and whatnot. But like these people are kind of like a bit chauvinistic and intellectually, in a way
mhm.
that I think is can be very compelling for people who haven't like thought about it much. But as someone that studied philosophy and has studied philosophy of science, I find it particularly troubling the way that kind of these like pop scientists are trying to sell science as like a religion or a philosophy. I think it's pretty troubling, and it's also quite nuanced because I do think that science has its place, and is important. But
Yeah.
yeah, we don't have to go into that.
Yeah. The only thing I will say is I feel like in that kind of situation where you're basically denying the need for philosophy or spirituality, I think what happens is it just goes into the shadow. to pull a Jungian
Right.
concept out. But I mean, seriously, I think if you're trying to say like my objective point of view, which by the way is always incomplete, which someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson will acknowledge, like
Hmm.
science is always questioning and never, you can never really fully prove things because you might have a new hypothesis or a new better explanation. Um, so if you're trying to like eradicate
Hmm.
the need for a philosophical framework because you supposedly have objectivity, even though you just said it's incomplete,
Hmm.
um, it's going to appear in a different way. And so I think that's, I tread lightly when it comes to criticizing science,
Hmm.
because I think people in astrology go a little too far because it's like a
I agree.
resentment more than a real engagement.
Hmm.
Sometimes, I mean, there is obviously both.
Yeah.
And also because like my dad's a scientist, so I'm just kind of
Uh-huh.
like, I don't want to put my foot in my mouth too much.
You have a personal
But
experience of someone who
yeah,
kind of, I don't
and I
know.
have a
Yeah.
and I have a like, I have a lifetime of personal experiences of seeing the value and wisdom of critical thinking applied
Absolutely.
correctly.
Yeah.
Applied with like actual rigor and not kind
Hmm.
of the boring, stupid version of that,
Yeah.
which is what usually emerges in pop culture,
Hmm.
especially if it's like a figure who's trying to like bring science to the masses, like ends up just like doing a disservice
Hmm.
to the underlying framework of
Right.
the scientific method, which should never pretend to be a philosophy, although it does have philosophical implications
Mm.
and or
Yeah.
whatever. I think
Hmm.
um I don't know. Anyway, yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's true.
We
We could
could
we
we
could
could get like
go forever.
deep into like Cartesian
Yeah.
like discourse on method, which basically is the genesis of the scientific method and the philosophical effects that that's had.
Mhm.
Um, I guess I don't want to do that in this conversation, but I guess I will say that I do think it's important, like perhaps maybe especially in the astrological community or just in society in general, to not think that critical thinking is synonymous with science, because I do think that uh, the abandonment of I've learned a lot of critical thinking by studying philosophy, and so I think that scientists, just like anybody else, can abandon critical thinking for their own kind of dogmatism. So I don't know. I'm not really preaching anything. Like, I'm not
Yeah,
trying to
yeah.
say that science is bad. I don't think that that's true. I'm not trying to say that we should worship science or be overly critical or dismissive of it. I think
Mhm.
that, yeah, we have to have nuance in the way that we engage with it, because it is, um, it's done a lot of benefit, but it's also um, can be, just like anything else, problematic and misused in ways.
Yeah, I strongly agree.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah, I was really interested in the fact that you were talking about like after the moon first kind of experience you had with like astral body, or a planet other than the moon was with Venus, because your moon is in Libra as well
Mhm.
as your sun. So Libra is a like important sign in your chart, and Venus is the domicile ruler of both of those lights. And so it feels fitting that you would have this like impactful personal relationship with her. So I'm just curious if you could tell me more about what you feel like it means, or I'm sorry, can you tell me more about the sign of Libra and what it means to you, and perhaps if you have any like stories or myths that come in that help you understand that sign.
Yeah. Um, so Libra, I always find it helpful to just like start with the basics
Mm-hmm.
when looking at signs. So, we have a cardinal air sign ruled by Venus,
Mm-hmm.
exaltation of Saturn,
Mm-hmm.
detriment of Mars.
Mm-hmm.
Um, all of that I think is important to really like understand it. Oh, and sorry, fall of the sun.
Yeah.
They're trying to forget that for my own benefit, however
I hear
briefly.
you.
And so, well, anyway, that's a lot of information. But I really experience. I think I got to start this one over.
Okay, no worries.
Yeah, sorry about that. Let me think.
Do you feel like laying out the dignities is like too much information?
Yeah, I went too far. I was like,
I
how
liked
about
it.
Saturn? Okay, we can just pick up however we pick up.
Okay,
I'll start over. I'll do the same thing again, but I'll just try to write it
cool.
out. Yeah, so whenever I think about Venus, sorry, one more time.
No worries.
So whenever I try to define a sign, I always like to start with the basics. In the case of Libra, it's a cardinal air sign ruled by Venus. Um, Also worth noting, it is the exaltation of Saturn, the detriment of Mars, the fall of the sun. So there's a lot of information contained just within that, which you could extrapolate ad nauseum,
Absolutely.
which is what I'm going to do.
Nice. That's what we want.
So, um, as you know, in air sign, I think Libra is clearly concerned with ideas, exchange of ideas. And I think as a cardinal sign, it's uh, you know, the generation of ideas. Um, it's not the only, it's not the only place where you generate ideas. But I do think Libra is compelled into action, which is why there's a lot of associations with like fairness and justice. Obviously compared to the opposite sign of Aries, it appears comparably a lot less active and action oriented, but that's just part of the Libra trickery. We're definitely out here starting shit all the time.
The
And
play of air or the initiation of air is a little bit more subtle than the initiation of fire.
Definitely. And like, Aries at its most Aries is the least subtle sign. That's kind of the defining feature. I also find it very helpful to look at the opposite sign when I'm trying to define a sign. I almost find it too helpful. It's weird. One thing that I find really interesting, my experience with Aries and with the many, many like great Aries friends that I have is that they're like Aries sons particularly, the way that they engage with obstacles could not be more different from me.
Okay.
Like I had an Aries best friend who like just would not even blink an eye when encountering an obstacle because it's just like, oh, great, here's a thing to run full speed ahead into and obliterate as best I can.
Yeah.
Doesn't that sound like fun? Whereas like if I enter, especially I think this is a moon thing, but I enter a room and like there's a thing that's misplaced that's like kind of in the middle of the room in a way that disrupts the sort of aesthetic and energetic flow, like I am already off my game because I'm like, oh, there's like this obstacle. And because I think Libra really has this idealized state that it wants to be in, of where everything is, in flow and obviously in balance. And, an obstacle is like, it takes a lot of energy to try to like go up against an obstacle when you're really mired in like Libra vibes, which I am. And there's obviously a lot more to say, but that came to mind. So yeah, and then I think it's as a Venus sign, if you compare Libra and Taurus is obviously so much more embodied. I think when I think about people that I know who have Venus and Taurus versus the people I know with Venus and Libra, the Taurus people just like really know what they like and what they don't like. and they
Hmm.
know what they want. Um, and it's not, I don't necessarily always see it as like being drawn to like these very obviously Venusian aesthetics per se, but
Hmm.
um, it's more, it just feels more personal in Taurus. Libra is a lot more, about where do we meet?
Mm, yeah.
Where does my aesthetic meet your aesthetic? I
Mm,
think, when you're leaning into a Libra aesthetic, it's a little more of like it's like, it's triangulation a little bit. It's like, what's the one size fits all aesthetic that isn't the lowest common denominator?
mm,
How do I, how do I find something that feels kind of elevated? Not necessarily chic, because that's probably projecting too much like whatever class or just
yeah.
particularities onto it. But
Mm,
I think there is a desire for like an elevated aesthetic that is going to please, as many people as possible without
mm,
some kind of degradation.
yeah.
Um,
It's
uh,
interesting to think about the distinction between Venus's signs and the difference between the element of earth and air, because
yeah.
I think the earth is more internal, perhaps, and air is like this external kind of extroverted element.
Mhm.
Um, that kind of like so it makes sense that with Taurus and the earth, there's this kind of more not like stability, but like yeah, and it's also a fixed sign, and there's this kind of consistency of um desire or consistency of like things that bring pleasure.
Mhm.
Whereas with Libra and the cardinality kind of initiation, it's like things are being kind of I'm reminded a little bit of like the fashion cycle and how there's like a new style every like how often are there new styles? It feels very Libran in that
Mhm.
sense, where there's a lot of new initiation that's occurring.
Yeah. It makes you realize that cardinal is like in a lot of motion and almost has more in common with mutability than you might think.
Mm-hmm.
It's not flux in the same way, because I think both mutable signs and cardinal signs are responsive, but
Mm-hmm.
um I think that mutable signs are responsive to facts kind of, and cardinal signs are responsive to opportunities.
Interesting.
It's like, oh, there's this like in the case of Libra, it's like there's an opportunity to generate harmony.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like as like a very Libra person, I feel that strongly. Like I think I'm always kind of scanning the room, and I'm
Mm,
always sensing opportunities to, even if it is subtle, it is not like an Aries mode, but I will, jump in that moment and like say the thing that I think will, make somebody feel more relaxed, or like change their
mm-hmm.
mind, or try to
Mm-hmm.
like get the group to agree. Um, and I have to say, with that, I think that there's a sense of responsibility that
Mm,
that Libra people, Libra placements, whatever it might be, kind of take on. Because it's like, if not me, then who? Is I
yeah.
think a really big kind of Libra mood. Um, I see this opportunity to kind of like get everybody on the same page, and I have to
Mm,
jump at it because, and with that, there's the responsibility, and there's also like the disquiet of like, what if nobody does, or what if it doesn't happen?
mm,
Um, but all of this stuff, I mean, it is hard to talk about a sign at the end of the day, because every sentence there's a little like voice in my head that's just like, okay, but which planet,
right, right. Because if not me, then who feels very like Saturn's exaltation in Libra
Mm,
to
yeah.
me, perhaps rather than Venus's like domicile there,
Mhm.
um, because of like Saturn's notions of Saturn and responsibility
Yeah.
feels like that. And yeah, it's like it's interesting to think with exaltation. It's like if you think of exaltation as like a party, it's like, okay, well, what kind of party does Saturn want to have? Like, how is Saturn partying in Libra?
Yeah. Or what is Saturn doing during the party? Like probably like not having as much fun, because Saturn is feeling like, well, I gotta I gotta like create the structure for everybody else to have fun.
Yeah.
Which is not to say Libras don't have fun, but I'm just, riffing on
Yeah.
that idea.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's like Saturn's exaltation feels kind of like a state dinner. It's like
Right.
something that's highly structured and like has a very clear unfolding to it, with like these rules of etiquette and rules of kind of like how to behave, how to engage, uh, which feel kind of hard to learn, but it is all very kind of clear how you're supposed to kind of conduct yourself. I don't know, that
Yeah.
comes
No,
to mind.
that's a strong image. And obviously, like, at the end of the day, maybe the state dinner is mostly just like a ceremonial event, but like inevitably you're hoping to conduct some diplomacy
Right.
while you're there, right?
Yeah.
Which
Yeah,
is obviously
absolutely.
a very Libra um task.
Yeah, totally. Um, yeah, I'm interested in, like, if we think about Venus and sect and we think about Venus morning star, Venus evening star, and the evening star's association with Taurus, perhaps because of the nocturnal nature of Taurus, and the morning star's association with Libra, perhaps because of the day sect connotations of air signs, and the morning star Venus being considered as like a warlike
Mm.
Venus. I'm interested, like I think in the past episode, I kind of on the nodes with Aaron Fogel, I kind of referred to this von Clausewitz quote, which von Clausewitz was like a military strategist, and it's the famous quote is like, "War is politics by other means," which felt in a sense kind of Libran, and I think there are all these examples of like world leaders with strong Libra placements. So there does feel like a kind of statecraft element uh,
Yeah.
to to Libra, and so I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that or anything.
Yeah, so the quote was war is politics by other means. It's interesting because I often think about how, let's say, in our system, democracy is essentially just like a stand-in for war.
Mm,
It's like we created enough sort of Saturn and Libra rules that define the etiquette that we can put down our swords and basically it's like if we had like instead of sending like 18-year-olds into battle, we had like, robot soldiers. And it was like, all right, well, my robots will fight your robots. That's
mm-hmm.
in a weird way, that's like how we conduct our politics.
Right.
We try to avoid violence, but we are essentially channeling our warring instincts
Mm,
into that domain so that we don't have to actually kill each other
right.
in order to like play out the power struggles.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's very delicate, and I think that all Libra environments feel very, very delicate.
Mm,
And that's that sense of like the scales and the balance. It's just like one tiny thing, then you need an adjustment. One tiny change, you always have to be adjusting to try to bring things back into balance.
right.
Um, and yeah, but it's true. There are a lot of the Libras on the world stage right now, and they're
Mm.
amazingly shady characters, I have to say, particularly Putin and Netanyahu.
Yeah.
Uh, my
One
my
one
two Libra brethren that I am pretty sad to share a sign with.
have to claim. Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing I want to say is that I'm strongly reminded of taking I think it was a comparative politics class in college. And we kind of talked about the distinction between quote unquote liberal democracy and electoral democracy.
Mm.
And what we found, it's like thinking back on the war, and I feel like we're getting like oddly political in this conversation, but thinking back to
That's
like
probably my fault.
the war in Iraq. Now I'm like low key actually pretty, yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
Uh, it, Many people, like in retrospect, the war in Iraq was like, we are trying to bring democracy to these people. And it's like, okay, well, they do not have a society. They have a very different society than we have. And we can't just take one thing and embed it in another and think that it will function in the way that it functions here. Every country is different. Societies are very different, different cultures. And there's all these examples around the world of countries transitioning to having electoral democracy, basically having elections, and there being surges in violence in those countries as a result, because there's not this institutional foundation that's underlying that. There's not civil society that's kind of underlying that, that's making that's kind of like sublimating or what have you, the violent impulses that can be associated with elections or, you know, political competitions. And so I think it's like a sad lamentation about our own society that, you know, there's this famous book called Bowling Alone about the kind of dissolution of civil society in the United States, which basically means like organizations and ways for people to get together and socialize and like form ties with one another. And there's like this increasing atomization in our society that makes people not have contact with other people and not have community. And how politically polarized the US has become. And there are a lot of economic factors about that too. But I think part of that is the fraying of the social fabric. And it feels kind of, I think civil society feels like a term that's Libran to me in some kind of way, or this idea of institutions being foundational to political functioning.
Yeah, I think we're finding a lot of different angles that bring us actually back to Saturn's exaltation. Yeah, I think in terms of like when you zoom out to like the sociological scale, that does seem to become like a very important element of Libra, if not the most important.
Yeah,
the way that the social contract you can build structures out of like what are these very delicate agreements basically, which can go civilization wide, or they can be small, but they have to be healthy at multiple levels, right? It has to be healthy on the community level to be healthy on the national level. And I feel like you can clearly see, you know, and there's like 400 different things to ascribe it to, but you can clearly see the regression and the backsliding in the USA about, you know, civil society and about those kinds of like norms and it is, yeah, it's definitely something. It's very interesting to watch in real time. Definitely scary.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I think to speak to the Venusian domicile of Libra just really quickly, it's interesting that like the idea of something like bowling being an important thing to bring people together, and this is like you know, it's fun to just get together with your friends. Like Venus is the planet of pleasure and union. It's kind of like the glue that can hold us together socially, and there does feel like something interesting about this idea of civil society and like it just being nice to get together with other people and do things together. That feels like very Venusian, and having that support the kind of social structures that Saturn is responsible for or brings to Libra.
Yeah.
So I think that's really interesting. And just also interesting. Go ahead.
Very good point. I'll just say, you know, bowling is just fun. Fun with your friends. That's how you build a strong nation.
Right. Is not bowling alone. Bowl with your friends, people. I'm interested to hear just before we move on, just a few of your thoughts about the fall of the sun. Because I think the one way we can think about it is seasonally, where Libra is the time where light is waning towards the winter solstice, which is the shortest day of the year at 0 Capricorn. So that's one way we can think about it. But I think we can also kind of think about just the nature of the sun as this constant thing that wants to continuously shine. We think about like the fixity of Leo, the sun sign. And you've talked a lot about the delicacy of Libra, the delicacy of social situations, and how that requires not constancy, but constant kind of rearranging and movement and adaptation to the different environment. And so I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on this, on what fall means and the sun's fall in Libra.
Yeah. I mean, all my reflections on Libra are so colored by having the sun in Libra, which is
Hmm.
not, you know, it's not a neutral position, right? I
Right.
have I have the sun in fall, um, and I certainly can speak to the kinds of issues that emerge by having that natally, um, where there's just this profound, um, what is it? There's this profound compulsion to set aside the self and not even necessarily the ego.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's quite right. But to try to do the impossible, which is to perceive things outside yourself and to move through the world in a way that sort of like bypasses the self,
Mm-hmm.
um, often in favor of perceiving the needs of another person or
Mm-hmm.
responding to other people or groups. Um, and I think that there, as much as I think, fall certainly is like, in a life, a planet in fall, I definitely think having this, it feels like a debility in a lot of ways,
Mm-hmm.
feels like I cause myself unnecessary suffering through these
Mm-hmm.
patterns. Um, but there are also really interesting gifts that emerge from that. Um, one thing that comes to mind for me is like I can't think of all of them right now, but there are a lot of writers with the Sun in Libra
Mm-hmm.
who I think have like a real sort of like social and sociological point of view. Like
Mm-hmm.
Arthur Miller,
Yeah.
always struck me. I think, having like Arthur Miller or Oscar Wilde or Arthur Rimbaud like as points of reference for me,
Mm-hmm.
um, definitely helps to balance out the Putins and Netanyahus of it
Yeah,
all.
totally.
Um, but I think that there's this. I think that Libra, the kind of gift of a Libra sun is in that act of trying to step outside and observe and sort of not quite erase, but not emphasize your own um, position, your own individuality, and your own point of view, and
Mm-hmm.
trying to like get a fair look at what's going on. It actually gives, I feel like it gives the Libra Sun um, person like a surprisingly sardonic and satirical angle,
Mm-hmm.
which can lead to like a really effective kind of social criticism or just reflection
Yeah.
of what's going on. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and it's interesting because there's when we talk about Libra, the underlying cliches are mostly about being superficial, about
Mm-hmm.
being a people pleaser, and like, sure, you know, it's not totally untrue, but I think it's when you get into the deeper things of like, yeah, what happens when the sun is caught in a sort of weird trap, and like people who experience that, what do they make of it? Like what kind
Mm-hmm.
of um what jewels can you find? I don't know, whatever kind of metaphor you want to use for making lemonade.
Right.
And I definitely personally feel like I am that kind of Libra sun.
Mm-hmm.
If I was listening to one of your other episodes, I think you had like a long conversation about Kim K. She's a
Mm-hmm.
Libra, right? Um,
That's a good
I'm
question.
pretty sure you talked about like everything about her chart except for her sun.
Yeah, that's true. I think she
Pretty
may
sure
be.
she's a Libra. You know, that's there,
Hmm.
right? Now what she has, which I also have, if I'm right, which I think I am, is Sun in fall ruled by Venus in fall.
Yes.
Um, Venus in
She
Virgo.
also
So
has Venus in Virgo. Yeah.
yeah. So like there's, which I don't have a point to make about that, but once you start trying to get into the weeds of any chart, you have to look at this whole network of rulerships, and
Right.
um yeah, but sun and fall is definitely a blessing and a curse, I would say.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, another thing I wanted to say. So one, you were correct. Kim Kardashian has the sun at 28 degrees of Libra. Um,
Wait, you
so
say
yeah,
20 or 28?
28.
Oh, okay. I was about to say, I was like, whoa, that's my degree.
Right. um, yeah, so she does have that kind of configuration that you're speaking to. Sag rising. So it's in the 11th and 10th house, her sun and her
Venus.
Venus. One of the things I was struck by was there. I went through a moment where I was watching an interview with Rosalia, the Spanish
Hmm.
musician, and I was really interested in her and her chart because she. I forget if I pulled her chart after or before, but like there was like 5 minutes into the interview and she was saying like the most Sagittarius rising shit I've ever heard. Like knowledge is freedom, and like my goal in life is to have as much freedom as possible. Like I was like, yeah, Sag rising sister, I feel you. But that led me to look at her chart and see that she had Mercury and the Sun in Libra in the 11th whole sign house. And I was like, looking at other musicians, and there was a lot of, I think James Blake is also Sun, Mercury in Libra.
Mm.
Although that we don't have a time for him, but there were a number of musicians where it was just like Sun, Mercury, and Libra, and it was just a really interesting configuration for a musician as well as a writer. I
Hmm.
thought too, those kinds of um yeah, thinking about like shining forth in this place where delicacy and like detail is required, and then also the kind of triplicity, rulership, resourcing that can come with Mercury in that place as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, was really, really fascinating. All right, wonderful. Yeah, so we talked a bit about the sign of Libra now. I'm curious to hear about your experience of the moon in Libra. And you also have this like really interesting context with your moon in Libra of being very close to your sun.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious how that kind of very early new moon phase affects your experience of it as well.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, honestly, when we first talked about doing this episode, I was like nervous about it because my sun and moon are so tightly linked.
Mm-hmm.
It can be difficult for me to distinguish, even from my own personal experiences. Obviously, I've tried to develop like an external perspective as well, for, so I can talk to other people, but um, it is hard to separate.
Mm-hmm.
Not only that, they're also in a dark house.
Right.
Um, so it's definitely one of the areas of my life that I find hardest to fully perceive.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah, I
the moon.
just want to say for listeners as well, I think I'm reminded of the conversation I had with Diana Rose Harper because she also has a very new moon in a dark house and articulated a similar experience of feeling like the sun kind of, uh, like obscures the moon in this way that it feels kind of hard to identify.
Yeah, it's like I can see the effects of my moon, and its placement. I definitely, I think if I'm getting back to just basics, of like somatic experience
Mm-hmm.
and emotional experience, I think the two things that the moon in Libra really gives my life is like this profound sensitivity to other people,
Mm-hmm.
what other people are experiencing and thinking and feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And I really just tie my core experience to other people, and what's going on for them. Um, it's hard for me to even know what I'm feeling independently of other people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Obviously, I have brought these things to the appropriate places to try to, you know, to try
Right.
to learn how to move beyond that as much as I can, or to manage and live with that, because obviously that can lend itself to all sorts of codependent kind of stuff, which it
Mm-hmm.
does. And there's also a sensitivity to environment, and I find this to be really true for Moon and Libra people that I encounter in my life. Where it's just like something I said earlier, like you walk into a room and there's an object that's kind of like blocking the vibe, blocking the flow. And like I
Mm-hmm.
just like can't relax. I remember I used to in college, I used to hang out at this house that was like a bunch of my friends lived there, and they just were like classic college slob boys. And there was this one, the living room had this just awful, awful light
Mm.
on the ceiling, just like a, overhead lighting gone wrong.
Hmm.
And like it was one of those lights where like the glass, whatever you call it,
Cover, what
um
have you?
yeah, was like had all these weird marks. So it just looked like this like grotesque, like veiny thing. And it was amazing to me how like I could never settle and just like feel like good or chill in
Mm.
this room
Hmm.
with these people, um, no matter what was going on, because I just couldn't handle the horrible lighting.
Hmm.
Um, I definitely think that also probably speaks to Venus and Virgo. Just that sort of like
Mm.
nitpicky, like, what if we could just fix this? It's just not quite right.
Yeah.
And given that the moon is leaning on Venus and Virgo, I feel like that kind of ties my environmental sensitivity to a sort of like perfectionism and critical lens,
Hmm.
which will never leave me alone.
Yeah.
Um,
It's interesting thinking about the moon as embodiment, but I've heard it planets in the first house kind of as central to the natives embodiment as well. And
mhm.
so it's interesting you kind of talking about Venus and the sign of its fall kind of manifesting in this way for you personally.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and it's like my Venus is pretty close to my Mars, and so I
Hmm.
have just like this real, it then becomes a restless kind of fidgety energy.
Mm.
So I walk into a room, I size it up, I see all the things that I don't like. I have to like try to like calm down and just like settle in. But I feel like I have this real weird sort of aesthetic and environmental sensitivity.
Mm.
Um,
So perhaps it's like good for Libra moons to allow themselves to and like allow the importance of environment and allow
mhm.
like the creation of a beautiful environment to or soothing
Yes.
environment to like be within.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking for myself, it's not like I was just like brought into the world with this like impeccable taste and like
Hmm.
ability to cultivate like the most amazing space. I had to, and I still don't have that, but it is important for me in my life, and so I have, through trial and error, in a very Venus and Virgo way of just like not liking a lot of things, and
Hmm.
a lot of experience of feeling dissatisfied. I've like gradually learned, um, bit by bit, how to like manage that sensitivity and like for myself. I'm also one of those people who like goes a little crazy when I walk into a grocery store with fluorescent lighting.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
don't know why.
Yeah.
So that's kind of silly, but it's a real thing because it is that, getting back to that in like core meaning of the moon of just like how do you feel,
Hmm.
um, and um, but yeah, but the sun piece, I think it really amplifies my, um what I was saying about just being like overly aware of what everybody else is thinking,
Hmm.
because it's like on top of that I have a debilitated sun, which is
Hmm.
not really, helping me to stand in my own sort of experience and my own identity,
Mm.
regardless of everybody else around me.
Right.
And then it's kind of like, as you said, with the new moon phase and with my moon being like fully dark, um, I think it's like those ego issues that I have are kind of like overshadowing and blocking out, the light of the moon.
Mm.
Um, and so it makes it even more difficult for me to tend to like, how are you feeling?
Yeah.
Like I'm constantly just like treating that as like tertiary at best,
Mm.
not even secondary.
Yeah.
Um,
In some ways though, is it a very embodied experience of a lot of the sun things that you described of, being very attentive and aware of the environment. It's like
Hmm.
a very the feeling of feeling that in your body really intensely, even if there's a kind
Yeah.
of disconnect where you're not thinking about that so much of how you're feeling.
Yeah. Well, I might be thinking about what I'm going to do.
Mhm.
You know, I'll be thinking like I'm uncomfortable, but often I'll be just like instinctively reaching for, like I was saying earlier, those opportunities
Yeah.
to shift the vibe, because a lot of the
Hmm.
times it's not the lighting, it's just the mood. Um,
Yeah.
it's the tension, you
Hmm.
know.
Hmm.
As with any person, it's really hard for me to distinguish between all the planets in my chart. And like, I also have Mercury in Scorpio, so I think that adds yet another layer of sort of like, my mind is maybe overly probing. Um, so
Hmm.
it's like, what am I concerned with? Everybody else. And
Hmm.
like, how does my brain work? It's like by digging very deeply into places that maybe I have no business being,
Hmm.
just kind of on autopilot. Um,
Yeah. I'm sorry, Jared. Can we hold on for one moment? Because I
yeah.
realize I'm supposed to do something at 4:15 and I have to tell this person I'm gonna be a bit
Mm.
late.
Hmm.
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
A neighbor's like picking up my surfboard that I'm giving to them.
Wow.
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna wait for them to respond. But two things I wanted to ask you is I wanted to kind of like talk a little bit about how you navigate some of the things that you've talked about, like
Hmm.
and framing it within like my own, kind of astrology and how I've learned to kind of navigate that stuff because I think that that can be really helpful for listeners as well to not just have like, okay, this is the embodied experience, but like what are the ways that we've kind of learned to operate with those influences. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, so what I'm gonna do, if it's okay, is I'm just gonna put this surfboard outside really
Oh
quickly,
yeah.
and so that we don't have to deal with it.
All good.
Okay. Okay, I'll be right back.
Cool.
All right. Okay. Cool. All right. Okay, so yeah, we talked a little bit about right. So one of the things I wanted to ask about that, you just talked about some challenges that perhaps could come up with Mercury. You've also talked about Mars and Venus in your first house, and I have a Moon Mars conjunction in my first house, and one of the ways that I've kind of like learned that I have to navigate that is just like kind of needing to move my body basically every day, you know?
Mhm.
So what it's been and that's kind of changed over time, I think, with the mutability of the first, uh, as well as Aries being my fifth house. So there's this kind of like cardinality to that as well, starting different things. But what's been lately is like skateboarding, getting back into a childhood hobby that actually happened around my the Aries eclipse, like near my IC.
Hmm.
And so moving every day, skateboarding, it just like really helps take like the edge off with the Moon Mars conjunction, take like some of the anxiety away, some of the um, challenging emotions that could come up otherwise if I'm not like letting that energy out somewhere.
Mhm.
And so I'm just curious, like, how, if there are ways that you've kind of learned to work with the like Mars Venus co-presence that you have in Virgo, as well as the Mercury, Mercury and Scorpio, and like the depths that
Mm.
can come with that, and like sometimes the challenges that can come with like wanting to go too deep.
Yeah. Um, Maybe I'll start with the Mercury Scorpio. Um, I I like it's a lot of different things. Like I think on one hand, I just have to let myself go down rabbit holes
Mm-hmm.
and appreciate the experience. I also have to acknowledge when I'm reaching like a bottomless zone and I could just
Mm-hmm.
go on forever. Um, because I think something that happens to me is I will return with a newfound sense of horror after
Mm.
following whatever like morbid obsessive thought that I have. I'll just be like, I have this desire then to share with people, but like people that probably don't really want to know,
Mm.
and they don't need to know, and it's fine. And
Yeah.
so if I allow myself to go that far, like I have to just accept that I'm probably going to carry that burden alone of
Mm.
whatever thing that I just went way too deep into.
Yeah.
Um, so, ultimately, I think it's one of these things where you have to just learn like over and over again until you're just like, maybe I will pause rather than
Mm.
to follow this extremely compulsive energy. What with Pluto being conjunct, sorry, what with, there we go, Mercury being conjunct Pluto and the South Node. I mean, my mind is very compulsive
Mm.
in that way. Um, Mars and Venus, I mean, yeah, I like right now I'm doing something with my hands. I'm always doing something with my hands. I'm just
Mm.
playing with something. Um, I'm usually bouncing my leg. I'm usually tapping. I've been tapping on desks since I was like 6.
Yeah.
Um, Always a very
I've been doing the same leg tap,
yeah.
since I've been a kid too. I get that.
Yeah, always a very earnest, attentive student who was very disruptive in this,
Mm.
unconscious way of just
Right.
whatever might, well, usually more like something like
Yeah.
that. But yeah, so I mean, the main thing, like for my Mars, Venus, and Virgo, like what came through at an early age was I started playing drums, and
Mm.
I just needed to put all that energy somewhere.
Yeah.
Because it's like it's the energy is so restless that it usually can't be articulated. It has
Mm.
to be it has to get to a more core um kind of expression, which there's
Right.
nothing better than just hitting stuff.
Right. There's nothing more like core to the central, like this. It's like a central human experience to like kind of
Yeah.
beat out a rhythm.
Yeah. And also, it gets very Virgo because you can get really focused on the details. And it's
Hmm.
actually very calming to loop a rhythmic pattern and just
Mm-hmm.
try to get it, particularly when you're getting into really like complex, what's the word I'm looking for? Um, Whatever. When you're using four limbs all at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
in a really complex way, to just keep looping that until it starts to feel natural. Something that
Mm-hmm.
starts by feeling extremely unnatural and self-conscious and um, imposed on your body starts to feel supernatural, and then focusing on the timing of it, like
Mm.
that kind
Yeah.
of thing. Even though I've never been great at like really structured, disciplined practice on any instrument,
Mm.
that
It's
is
that
that's
mutable rising life.
yeah, for sure. Gemini MC.
Feel that.
10, 10 pursuits all at once.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, I think that is like the number one thing that emerged in my life as like a therapeutic
Mm.
mitigating tool.
Now, do you like that kind of music? Do you like very technical drummers? And
Not
I
even
asked,
really.
yeah, I asked this because like I love playing sports. Like I love
Yeah.
doing things with my body. I could not like I like watching like skateboarding TikToks, but that's about the extent of it.
Sure.
I don't like watching a football game or something like that. Or
Yeah. No, I
I
don't sit
don't.
around watching like videos of drummers, and like also like I'm like a little bit hopelessly ignorant of like all of the great drummers. I mean, not, I know some stuff, but
Mhm.
I'm not particularly focused on it. I'm also, I play a bunch of different instruments, and I'm ultimately more drawn to like songwriting and lyrics in
Right.
terms of like that's what captivates my attention.
Hmm.
So yeah, it is drums is more, it's like it serves more of a purpose of like it's just good for me.
Yeah.
And it's, I've played drums with a lot of people in my life, and I never really made it and it's probably my greatest talent, actually.
Mm.
Maybe, I don't know.
Hmm.
Um, but I never made it my focus. Um,
Interesting.
yeah, it's kind of weird, but
Mm. Yeah, very interesting. So yeah, you've talked about those two things, and then you've also talked about like the moon in Libra and like how attending to your feelings is like a tertiary thing. Do you feel like you've like made strides on that, or like have you kind of worked with or like kind of um yeah, like addressed some of the challenges with the moon combust
yeah.
uh that may come up?
Yeah, well, I have a lot of different frameworks in my life for kind of addressing my various, pathological tendencies.
I don't mean to like, I hope I didn't frame it like that
No,
because I
you
didn't mean
didn't.
it like
I'm
that. But
I'm just doing my thing.
yeah,
Um,
believe me, I have
but
a very Saturnian sense of humor as well, but I don't like to like put that on other people,
impose.
obviously.
Yeah. No, I mean so I have various frameworks, therapeutic and otherwise networks of people, et cetera, to like
Mm-hmm.
manage especially my more codependent
Mm.
tendencies, which
Yeah.
is a very important part of my life. And I'm sure that will continue to develop for decades. And I
Mm-hmm.
will change, how I manage that. Um, I definitely think, something that comes up with the moon in Libra is like, I think a lot of people with the moon in Libra struggle in certain ways with being alone.
Mm.
Um, but I also think that having that issue, you kind of go through different stages, and your relationship with that changes over time.
Mm-hmm.
I think Kira Taborn like tweeted something like about how people with Moon and Libra like can't be alone, and
Mm.
I saw it and I was like, sure, but I kind of took issue with it. But then I thought about it some more, and because I realized like when I was young, I really, really struggled with that. Like I would go to summer
Yeah.
camp, not even being alone, but like being away from, whatever it is, home or
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
familiar surroundings. Like I would go to summer camp and just like I would be the saddest little boy.
Oh,
It was just I like missed home. I used to get so homesick. It was
wow.
crazy.
Yeah.
Um, and I eventually kind of like had to just sort of like break that. I had to break that in a
Mm-hmm.
like kind of traumatic way. Like I eventually just like moved to a foreign country where I didn't speak the language, where I didn't know a single person for, 12 months, and like
Mm-hmm.
really just kind of like changed and toughed it out.
Mm-hmm.
And then in my 20s, like I really struggled with I would say a pretty like not necessarily clingy, but like my first few relationships naturally were like super like, you know, just like really maybe overly intimate and close and like
Mm-hmm.
always together,
Yeah.
going, in a mutual way.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think in my 20s, coming out of one particularly difficult breakup, I really had to just like, I lived alone for the first time. And then once I got used
Mm-hmm.
to that, I was honestly like a lot of the time, I think I was pretty lonely, but
Mm-hmm.
um, I came to value that a lot. And
Mm-hmm.
I needed that kind of harshness to start dealing with those patterns of mine so that I
Right.
could learn to be alone. And now I'm like back in like a really, um, like close partnership. We're always together all the
Mm-hmm.
time. And
Mm-hmm.
um, I definitely need alone time, but I do feel that tendency starting to come back because now I'm like, oh, but I'm like safe and secure, and like this
Mm-hmm.
relationship isn't going anywhere, so maybe it's fine to go
Yeah.
back into those patterns. But
Mm.
I think having alone time is like super important, and I like it now,
Yeah.
where I didn't really like it when I was 17.
Mm.
Um,
I feel like that can be very
although,
helpful.
yeah,
Just like the pleasure of the thing that used to be feel foreign or used to feel unpleasurable.
yeah, I also think that part of it is that like I'm a creative person. I spend so much of my time trying to tap into creativity for various functions, and
Mm-hmm.
it's being creative alone is extremely different from being creative with other people. And
Right.
if you're like
Yeah.
me and you're like overly sensitive to what everybody's thinking and feeling, being creative with other people can be extremely amazingly invigorating, but it can also be like extremely taxing.
Right.
And I think I value, solo creative time the most out of all life experience. Like that is the most
Mm.
important thing for me.
That's beautiful.
Um, which is interesting as a Libra moon. I feel like it's because I think creativity and like that experience of like whatever it might be, kind of interfacing with a muse figure, whether
Mm.
that's just an internal projection or you want to actually take it literally, it is kind of an other, you know. So
Mm.
I don't have to sacrifice that Libra moon um dynamic of an exchange or an interchange with something seemingly outside of myself, because that is what the creative experience feels like for me.
Mm.
There's like a feedback mechanism of like you have ideas, you have thoughts, you try stuff, it works or doesn't work, you draw conclusions, you try again. um it's not just like me and my super brain sit down and immediately have all the best ideas.
Mm-hmm.
But you do need kind of space for that. And for me, that's definitely super important. Like I need that in a
Mm.
lunar way, I think.
Mm. Mm. That's
Yeah.
really beautiful. I feel like there's very, I don't know if I could say, I don't know the exact term you use, but I don't know if I could say like, this is one of the most important things for me in my life. And I don't know that a lot of people can say that. So it's
Mm.
cool, I think, when people are like, yeah, this is what I do. And like,
Hmm.
this is really important for me. And to actually create space for that and have that be a part of your life is really amazing. So yeah, thank you
Yeah.
for sharing
Thanks
that.
for reflecting that. I think the other thing about just dealing with any like, potentially or arguably difficult placement in your chart, when and knowing how that shows up in your life, like there are a lot of opportunities to perceive the assets
Mm,
of those placements, and like
yeah.
for instance, like I was talking about environmental sensitivity. One of my best assets is because I'm a musician, like between my moon in Libra and my Venus in Virgo, which rules it, if I'm in like let's say a studio working on music with some people, um, a lot of the time, like when you're mixing, you're just listening. for, the overall vibe, but also the details, and what small adjustments can be made to improve the sound overall. And like, I think that I know from experience, I have an extremely finely tuned ear for like really kind of minuscule details that make a difference in a mix. And it's often me communicating with like a recording engineer. Sometimes they'll just be like, "Oh my God." It might seem like, certainly sometimes it is nitpicky because it's like that thing's going to drive me crazy for the next 50 years.
Right.
But also I think I often surprise the engineers that I work with, where I'll have something, I'm like, I feel like we need reverb on the snare drum, or whatever it might be. Like there's this one frequency of this one, you know, there's this one frequency in the acoustic guitar that is getting in the way of this other thing. That's what mixing is all about. Mixing couldn't be more Libra. And sitting there with your faders trying to get the right balance between all the tracks. And there are so many opportunities for me to like apply my kind of extreme and often irksome qualities and turn them into skills. And it's just, sometimes it's just as simple as like, I just need to make sure that I keep putting myself in situations where I can use those things as skills and not let them run away and become dictatorial.
Yeah. It does feel very fitting for Venus and Virgo with like your Libra luminaries of like minuscule changes in the details changing the big picture, like the Venus and Virgo really affecting like this kind of bigger picture that's in Libra, especially as it relates to like beauty or an aesthetic or like an artistic experience. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Astrology works.
Yeah, astrology is wild. Are there any aspects that the moon makes in your chart that you think would be important to talk about?
It's like there's a whole sign trine to Jupiter. I'm still waiting for that one to show up in a clear way in my life. I don't know if it will. The moon is separating from the sun, but it's still very close. But then it's going into arguably a void kind of situation, depending on your definition of a void moon.
Right.
So in a way, my moon is like really dark and really kind of empty, because a conjunction of the sun is an unusual aspect. It's not like other aspects.
Right.
And it's the beginning of this cycle. So I really feel like having a new moon in Libra, it's like, it's very empty. It's very cardinal. I feel like I do have this really intense, kind of sense of possibility with that.
Which is often described as part of the new moon.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, it's like, what can we do in this new cycle? I think I'm depending on the time of day and the mood I'm in, I can get like really fucking excited about potential and possibility. And I have just like a zillion ideas all the time, like way more. I have like very kind of classic cardinal problems which I think has some commonality with like Sag energy,
sure.
Just like let's go do all these things, and like you do like 5% of them, but it was fun while it lasted.
It's fun having the ideas for sure. Yeah, it's fun getting excited about the potential.
So I definitely have that.
Interesting. Yeah, I was thinking about your Jupiter in relation to the story you told about moving abroad, and I was just something that came to mind because your IC is in Sagittarius, and so it feels interesting that like Jupiter rules this point that's like associated with home, and in this house that's associated with home. And then there's something about like Venus ruling the second, but also ruling the ninth, being in the first, like something about like travel being associated with identity. I don't know that there's anything there, but
No,
there's
it's definitely there. I
something
think of how
interesting
many
about that.
stories I shared was just like, here are all the ways that I like found myself while I was abroad. Um,
Yeah.
Definitely. Um, and I think I was in a ninth house perfection at the
Mm,
time. Um,
interesting. Yeah, that's incredible.
yeah. And then, I mean, there's definitely some stuff to be uncovered in my chart where it's like my Mars and Venus have this conjunction. They're both angular. They're ruling second, third, eighth, and ninth. And there's
Hmm.
definitely ways that these houses are tied together for me. Maybe not all of which I want to get into, but like one
Yeah,
that's
that's okay.
easy is like third and ninth. Like, yeah, I had this completely like life altering and life defining year where I was living in South America. And like, where did I get the idea? From my brother, who also had a
Hmm.
life defining, year living in France for his study abroad.
Amazing.
Um, so, it's stuff like that.
Are you close with your brother?
Yeah,
Nice. So it's
yeah,
just interesting, very descriptive of the
yeah.
third house is the house of siblings. You have the ruler of the third and the first conjunct.
The ruler
Uh,
of the ninth.
yeah. So it's
There's
interesting. You
plenty
also
more
have
where that came from.
you also have the ruler of the first in the third. So there's this kind of
Yep.
first third switch.
Yeah. I actually have two
Um,
brothers. And yeah, and I'm the youngest, so they loom large in my
mm,
life and in my childhood.
very cool. Very interesting. Yeah. So there's something about your chart that's communicating like the importance of siblings to like your identity with
Mhm.
that in your first house. Amazing. Thank you for explaining that. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the moon and this just the general cycles of the moon, transits of the moon as that relates to your life. Have you seen any kind of any patterns show up tracking that?
Yeah, I see patterns every day,
Mm.
which makes it hard to summarize.
Hmm.
Um, and what's funny is like every time I think I've discovered like, oh, I have a hard time during, when the moon is in whatever,
Yeah.
um, then the other planet transiting planets will move, you know, and it's like, oh, maybe Leo moons aren't quite as problematic for me as I thought they were, you know,
Right. Now that
or
Saturn's in Pisces and not in
yeah,
Aquarius. Yeah.
yeah. That's so sometimes it's like I actually need like a lot more perspective. As fast as the moon moves, it's always contacting everything else.
Right.
Um, but I definitely it's interesting as a new moon person. I feel like I'm always looking forward to the full moon. I feel
Mm,
like I always want the cresting intensity
mm,
of life. Because I think that new moon vibe of like where, your best bet is to just like be ascetic and just like do like 3 hours of meditation or whatever,
hmm.
I'm just like I appreciate any off ramp from that mode,
Hmm. Yeah.
where it's like, oh, life is just going and it's kind of crazy, but it's exciting. I feel like I really appreciate and enjoy the wildness
Mm,
of a full moon. Maybe just because it's so different from my birth chart.
right. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think there is something about, again, to talk about the opposition. I feel like it's an interesting aspect because it does feel like each sign has a little element of the opposite sign within it. So there's like a
Yeah,
kernel, of Aries and Libra somehow, and vice versa.
yeah,
Kind of like, yeah, I've spoken about this before, kind of like the yin yang sign kind of comes to mind, where there's like a bit of white in the black and vice versa, and there's like a balance with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and opposition is like things equally putting equal force on each other. So there does feel like a kind of balance that comes in some kind of weird
True.
way.
Yeah. So full moons are kind of naturally Libra-ish.
Yeah,
Just like,
perhaps for you in particular because of your like new moon Libra.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, yeah, all that said, like I find it really hard to like if I've ever done, let's say, gone on somebody's podcast to do like a forecast or something, and it's just like, okay, so
Hmm.
what do you think about this new moon? What do you think? What do you expect? That kind of stuff. I'm always like, I don't know, it's gonna be a new moon, like, like, or same with full moons. I mean, full moons are a little easier because it's like it might be kind of an intense time.
Hmm.
But I remember when I was first getting into like the real deal astrology and like really learning the whole structure and getting into Hellenistic stuff. My fiance and I would like read, I don't even know which random websites that I can't even remember anymore, but just like she would come across these full new moon or new moon horoscopes.
Hmm.
Um, and it was both one of the things that it was like pushing me away from astrology, but also like pulling me toward like better astrology because it just felt like every time it was always the same.
Yeah.
Um, and so I do kind of feel that way about there's like an overemphasis on trying to have so much to say about every lunation,
Hmm.
um, without doing the work of like with depending on the person. Like I think it's just
Right.
so much more important to like think more cyclically,
Hmm.
let's say about what happened 6 months ago, stuff like that.
Right.
And I just find it, like I was saying earlier, like my best work with the moon is mostly just like, where is it right now and how do I feel?
Right.
You
Yeah,
know?
and for listeners who are maybe like new to thinking about new moons and full moons and stuff, 6 months is an important time frame because if you have a new moon in a sign, you'll have a full moon like 6 months later or what have you, because the sun will basically be in the opposite sign. Um, and
Right.
so there's this kind of half year cycle that can come with new moons and full moons that you can kind of think about what happened at the new moon and perhaps something similar is happening at the full moon, perhaps, something to think about.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, cool. Thanks for that. Any other suggestions for someone who's like new to astrology or planetary relationship in forming and initiating a relationship with the moon?
Yeah, I think back to what I was just saying, like if you're relatively new to astrology, but you've learned aspects and you understand more or less what the planets are bringing,
Mm-hmm.
I think that tracking the moon is the best way. Tracking the moon and how it makes you feel, or how it corresponds to what you are feeling,
Mm-hmm.
is the best way to dial in, more precise and better understandings of those aspects and
Mm-hmm.
the way that planets, interact or just what effect planets have. And, you have to keep in mind all the complexity and nuance of like, well, this is this planet in this sign and
Right.
all of that stuff. But this is why it's so useful because it happens fast enough that you can actually see gather a good amount of information in a relatively short time.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if there was no moon, first of all, you probably wouldn't exist.
Mm.
But if there was no moon and we had to just track transits or come to our own unique understandings of how astrology works, like it would take way too long.
Mm.
It's just
Yeah.
like, okay, finally Venus has, made this sextile to Mars, and then now it's finally made this opposition. And every observation would take forever. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but the moon, it's gonna go everywhere in what 29 days
Right.
or whatever that is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's gonna also touch your entire chart, and it's gonna
Mm-hmm.
something that Austin pointed out in class a long time ago that I thought was really interesting was that the moon will also highlight the sequence of aspects in your
Mm.
own chart, where like it will aspect this thing and then this thing and then this thing in the same order that everything else will, albeit without any retrogrades and all that
Mm-hmm.
stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, the moon really shows us like the rhythms of life,
Mm.
um, in a way that, you know, no other. I mean, I guess it's the sun and the moon that really
Right.
govern the day-to-day rhythms of life
Mm-hmm.
on their own sort of timeline and their own scale.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and they, it's, and I find them so interesting because they're just maybe the hardest to interpret astrologically on
Mm.
some level, because they're just so they cut to such a deep place of just like
Mm-hmm.
being alive.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The sun has this like yearly cycle and the moon has this monthly cycle. And so there really is this kind of immediacy and an initiatory element that comes with the moon, which we've kind of been talking about this whole time. But yeah, I like that you emphasize that.
Yeah, and it just
Wonderful.
reflects the chaos of life a little better. You know,
Mm-hmm. That's so true.
the sun is so orderly and life is not. You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. 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 The moon is like waxing and waning and has its like relationship to the sun, which is really important. And the sun is changing position every day. And so the relationship between the two is different every day. And yeah, the moon has all these craters that it's, kind of accumulated over time through its life cycle. And yeah, it is very kind of like analogous to life itself, just cyclical and
Yeah,
unsteady.
I feel like one thing that I thought about before this conversation that I still kind of want to mention along those
Mm-hmm.
lines is the moon. If you were to look at the moon from a much larger perspective, like the perspective of the solar system as a whole, the
Mm-hmm.
moon is so tiny
Yeah.
and so unimportant.
Mm-hmm.
It's just this little thing.
Yeah.
You know, Earth is already so tiny compared to the sun, and the sun's not even a particularly big star, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the moon is like, you know, a portion of the size of the Earth. Um, but I think that's what's so interesting about it is because from our perspective as living creatures on Earth, the moon is like so has such outsized importance. It has such
Mm-hmm.
big impact on our life. You know, it creates the tides. It has this, you know, the whole ebb and flow of the lunar cycle affects plant life and animal life so dramatically. And I'm sure
Mm-hmm.
our you know psyches and bodies in ways that we still don't understand. Um, and it really like governs the cycles of life. And I feel like without the moon, if we just had the sun, like it would be a dead world. You
Mm-hmm.
know, it would be a more orderly world, sort of, but like with nothing happening. You know,
Mm-hmm.
um, because I feel like there's this friction between the solar calendar and the lunar calendar that kind of creates that um yeah that pace of life. And I just think that it seems like, you know, without the moon we probably wouldn't have developed life
Yeah.
on Earth. But I don't know if that's actually true. It's just an idea I've encountered.
Well, I was recently back in New York, in my hometown, and I was like wading through this tide pool because there was a flood that basically happened that kind of flooded much of the beach. So
Mm.
there were tide pools. And as I was wading through the water, I was thinking about the sign of Cancer, the moon sign, and Jupiter's exaltation in Cancer and Jupiter's associations with life and the growth of life.
Hmm.
And I was reminded of this idea, which was put forth, at least when I was in school studying biology, of like the primordial ooze and
Yeah.
how life came about on Earth, which was basically like in tide pools,
Yeah.
lightning striking tide pools, lightning, Jupiter,
Oh my
uh,
God.
or some equally kind of like catalytic force,
Sure.
like lightning or something like that. And it literally rearranged the carbon and hydrogen and nitrogen, all these different atoms, into organic material. And the difference between organic material, what makes up life, and inorganic material is not one of form, but one of not one of substance, but one of form. So it's just carbon and hydrogen and nitrogen arranged in a particular way. And so there does feel like this really astrologically important kind of association with the moon and life as it relates, I think, to Jupiter's exaltation. That's not like super straightforward, which I thought was really fascinating thinking about recently.
For the sake of Jupiter's exaltation in Cancer in astrology, I hope that scientific theory is borne out to be correct.
Mm-hmm. I hope so too. I'll have to like go back and check because it was like pretty there was like agreement when I was in high school studying biology, AP biology, but it's been 15 years since then. So, theories may have progressed, but
but I love the even like the Zeus tie-in of the lightning bolt. It's pretty good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not that it matches Greek mythology or anything, but even just the symbolism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. All right, Jared, is there anything you want to add? Do you have any imparting thoughts before we go?
No, I think we've said a lot.
I think we've done it.
My brain has turned into primordial ooze.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry to I'm sorry I had to do that to you. All right, where can we find
for the pod?
Anything for the pod? Yeah, I appreciate that. All right, Jared, where can we find you? And is there anything you're working on you'd like to let us know about?
You can find me at my website, which is mercuriusgeorge.com. I'm sure it'll be in the show notes, but Mercurius is spelled without an O, kind of like a Latinized imaginary name. I like to say that it's a reference to Demetra George. That was not true in its origin, but now it's canon. So mercuriusgeorge.com is my website. I'm not on Twitter.
Did you stop? Are you done with it?
Yeah, I just was like, there were lots of reasons, but like, from my own identity standpoint, I was just like, that's enough anti-Semitism for me.
I think I remember you saying that now that you mention it.
It's just a little too obvious. I just can't be here.
I feel that.
But that's not, I could have come to that conclusion for many other reasons. But I am on Instagram. I'm Mercurius George Astrology. If you happen to know the person who has at Mercurius George, please give them my email. And I'm on Threads with the same handle. Mercurius
awesome.
George,
so you're making the move from Twitter to Threads.
For now, we'll see.
I think we're all trying to figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, it's like whatever. I mean, jump from one, billionaire with too much power to another. Because like I even got pulled into this, and I was like, okay, yeah, no, Zuckerberg has 55% shares, I think, of the Meta Corporation. So he is just I mean, maybe not quite equally dictatorial, and obviously he behaves a little differently, but like, I'm not trying to be like pro Zuckerberg in order to be anti-Musk or anything.
Right.
Like, it certainly feels less fraught, internally, ethically, etc. on September 20th, 2023.
Yeah.
Don't quote me a year from now.
Yeah, I think the landscape will definitely be different a year from now.
Yeah.
But we're still all trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
All right, Jared. Anything else you want to share?
Oh, no, I was just going to say, but I do readings. I'm available. My calendar is pretty much always open. I don't end up doing a ton of readings, but available if you're interested and if you vibe with my style.
Awesome. I'll definitely be sure to link your website in the show notes. Thank you so much for coming on and talking to me for, I think, over 2 hours at this point. I really appreciate it. It was great to hear all of your thoughts about Libra and the moon, and I hope we can chat again soon.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
To support the show by donating or becoming a member, please visit my website, which is linked in the show notes. And please subscribe to the show wherever you listen. You can also find me on Instagram and Twitter. See those links in the show notes as well. If you have any questions or feedback on the show, please feel free to contact me via my website or email me at sphallhorary@gmail.com. In the show notes, you can also find links to astrologers and resources that we touched on in this episode. Thanks. See you next time.